I want to welcome a new friend in recent years, Abe Truitt. Abe Truitt is a young guy in Jewish-Christian relations. He's a passionate guy, and he's very articulate, and I've really appreciated getting to know him. And I wanted to invite him to be part of the convention and to speak and to share a little bit. Abe Truitt is 31 years old. He was born in Colorado and immigrated to Israel at age 12. Proudly dysfunctional in 2 languages, he says, Abe serves as the English coordinator for the organization Beyadenu. Beyadenu returning to the Temple Mount. And he's vice president of product for high-tech creating audiovisual solutions. Abe is one of the most inspiring young voices in the dialogue between Christians and Orthodox Jews that I have seen. And I have some questions for him, a couple of them. He's just been, I believe, on the Temple Mount today, bringing groups up. And I want to know if Christians have inspired his relationship with God and with the Temple Mount. And secondly, the CEO of Beyadenu recently, on the 31st of March, published an op-ed on Israel National News. Tom Nisani, the head of Beyadenu, published an op-ed where he wrote that every time we close the Temple Mount to Jewish foot traffic, it immediately sparks escalation. Prior to every month of Ramadan, the same assessment of the situation begin, which usually is centered around deciding whether to restrict Jewish ascent to the Temple Mount, which is already severely restricted for Jews. He says further, check me, and you will find that every time when the Temple Mount was more restricted than usual or closed to Jews altogether, the closure or restriction was the spark of serious riots on the Temple Mount, which from there very quickly brought the possibility of another military operation, such as the Guardian of the Walls, or a wave of attacks in Jerusalem, or only another unprecedented destruction of antiquities on the Temple Mount, all while leaving the Temple Mount at the mercy of terror organizations and foreign state interests. The escalation of violence does not occur because we, as the State of Israel, take a firm stance. On the contrary, every time we have shown weakness in the form of closing the Temple Mount, our payment was in blood. So, Abe, welcome to speak.
Thank you so much. As John said, my name is Abe Truitt, and I want to answer your questions in order and address everything in order, and you've set me up just perfectly. I mean, like, this is the segue of dreams here. Articulate, I don't know how articulate I am necessarily. I'm not much of a speaker at the end of the day. I like to engage my audience one-on-one, but there's a requirement for me to speak at the end of the day because I'm a witness. I'm a witness for what's happening in Jerusalem, for what's happening on the Temple Mount, for what's happening in the state of Israel on a day-to-day basis. And I have, in many ways, no choice but to stand in front of a microphone, in front of many people around the world, and share with you what I've seen. I was born originally in Colorado Springs, USA. I moved here 20 years ago with my family. I discovered actually a little bit later in my life that my great-grandfather was a Baptist preacher by the name of Clyde Sawyer, who came to the Temple Mount area in the 1920s. There's a picture of him riding a camel in Israel. There's a picture of him probably at the Temple Mount at some point, which has gotten lost over the ages. And I discovered this because I asked my father, you told me you converted, but from what? Like, where did you come from originally? And he said, well, over the years, my great-grandfather was always a Baptist minister, and I would go to hear some of his sermons and things like that, and he eventually found Judaism probably through my mother as well, who is a religious Jew. And so this incredible sort of foundation for my life was something I grew up not really knowing so much about. I grew up mainly within an ultra-Orthodox community in Colorado, very, very tight-knit. When you're in a smaller community in the United States, you'll find that the community is even more insulated than the larger communities around New York in those areas. And I found myself basically drawn to the world of Christian advocacy for the state of Israel through my position at the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. And how I got there was my father-in-law suggested that I meet with somebody because I talk to people on a regular basis. And I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And I remember actually the first encounter that I had with a group of pastors that were coming here to Israel to see the land for the first time. We were standing on the Mount of Beatitudes up in the north, and I was standing there very humbly, holding my hands together, wondering what I should feel in this sight, because I having no knowledge of the gospel whatsoever. And a pastor comes over to me and he says, Abe, what I can't stop thinking about in this moment, this space right now, I'm like, I have no idea. I just really don't know. He said, blessed are the cheesemakers. He was quoting Monty Python and the Holy Grail, something I had seen, and I finally realized that there was a place for me in this world. And it comes through a little bit of humor, it comes through a little bit of hilarity that I bring to the table as well. I always love essentially to break down the situation to a little bit more, point out all the ironies. And if you're not laughing, then you're not having fun in this whole experience. So I encourage you all to find the humor within the ironic situation that we are all faced with on a day-to-day basis, but still stand for the right side. You mentioned the article from Tom Nisani, and I think that, first of all, Tom said it 10 times better than I could possibly say, but what we're always doing every single time that we debate whether we're going to close the Temple Mount to the Jewish ascenders, whenever we're going to cause any kind of restriction, we're handing our enemies, we're handing terrorist groups around the world and organizations a negotiating chip. Here, why don't you take this scenario where, let's say, we can restrict restrict ascenders from walking up on the Temple Mount. Is that okay? They have to now hop out one foot. And the Hamas is like, yeah, if you don't do that, we're going to send rockets. And okay, well, how about we tell the ascenders you can only go up for this many days out of the year or this many days out of the year. And Hamas is like, yeah, if you don't do it for that many days, then we're going to send rockets. Okay, well, what if we tell our ascenders that you can't pray on the Temple Mount, you can't bring the religious items on the Temple Mount, and Hamas once again says, thank you for this gift. Thank you so much, Israeli government. You have given me the opportunity to use this as a negotiating tool within the media. I can threaten you now on the basis if you do not do what you say you're thinking of doing for the sake of human rights, for the sake of the Muslim worshippers that are going up to the Temple Mount, and we have every right to fight for Al-Aqsa. We have every right to send rockets and to attack the Israeli people over this issue. And Tom stated it really, really wonderfully. We're speaking to foreign media, and we were meeting with a journalist from Australia, and he said to him, "Fine, create some sort of scenario, like block Jewish ascenders from the Temple Mount for 10 days during Ramadan. That's fine, as a respectful gesture to them. But make that the official policy. The second that you've wavered from the official policy, you've essentially just handed the tools necessary to harm the state of Israel and to harm Jewish ascenders and to spark these riots and to create all this chaos around the Temple Mount to our enemies." And I think he said it fantastically well in that regard. My notes actually just came over here. I want to talk to you really briefly about what Beyadenu is and what we stand for. So we're the largest organization that's advocating for Jewish rights on the Temple Mount. What we do is we bring as many Jews as physically possible. We bus them in from all the areas around Israel as well. We have those buses sponsored by us for communities that need help with that. And we bring Jewish feet to the Temple Mount to walk up there. It's the number one thing that we do to change the status quo, to normalize Jewish presence on the Temple Mount on a regular basis. And this has effects, because oftentimes when a Jewish person walks up to the Temple Mount, and I've now recently discovered also Hayovel's groups, whenever they walk up to the Temple Mount, it sparks a lot of controversy from the Waqf and from the Israeli police, because God forbid we should pray. We should pray on this holy site. We should bring a religious symbol to this holy site. Heaven forbid that we do such things, and spark any kind of detestable situation from the Islamic Waqf. And so our first step is to change the nature, to change the policies today and bring Jews to the Temple Mount. That's number one. Number two, we also lobby in the government. We lobby against the police. We lobby against inconsistent policies, just like the one that Tom was mentioning that's fantastically segued for me here, to set policy for the Temple Mount. Is it Jewish? Is it Jordanian? Is it is it Iranian? Like who is governing the Temple Mount anymore? Like what are we doing up here? Are they allowed to tell us to restrict our free speech, to restrict our movement, to restrict us from bringing our religious symbols up here? Who's in charge here is essentially the question that we're posing to the Israeli government on a regular basis. We do this in incremental changes. A couple of our members, for example, get harassed for bringing up religious items or things that look like religious items. And I want to just, as a side note, just to maintain that level of humor as well. One of our ascenders also said to me that if we just printed Jewish symbols on the outside of soccer balls, then we would have a fantastic and easy time of going up to the Temple Mount there, because apparently soccer is encouraged and on the Temple Mount, and Jewish symbols of prayer are not. It's petitioning the police on a regular basis. It's calling out the police in their inconsistencies, calling out the Waqf in their inconsistencies in in discriminating against groups that are coming up to the Temple Mount on a regular basis that makes that incremental change. Already, we've managed to affect and shift policy from, for example, there's a briefing that Jews are given just before they go up to the Temple Mount, stating this area is unsafe and you really shouldn't bow down or pray or anything like that because you could incite a riot or a problem. So just don't do that. That whole briefing is illegal in nature. You're basically receiving information that has no requirement for your ears to hear. And what was happening before is the Israeli police were able to prevent ascenders from going up without hearing that information. And now, at least that tiny incremental change is that ascenders do not have to hear that briefing before they ascend to the Temple Mount. It's a step, and all of these steps are always in a direction of why can't the Jews also have equal rights on the Temple Mount when they're praying? Why can't all nations come to the Temple Mount and pray, worship, bring their religious symbols, have a barbecue? A barbecue, I mentioned, this is the Korban Pesach, of course, that I'm representing here. I'm not just encouraging barbecues on the Temple Mount. Let that not be on the official record. I want to actually follow very well the discussion that you had with Eliyahu here. I think it's a fantastic segue as well into essentially what I wanted to leave you with here today as well. And that is the reason for the temple's destruction. So the reason for the temple's destruction, many people know on the basic level, is due to baseless hatred. Baseless hatred was a hatred between mankind. It's something we can kind of imagine in our heads. Stacy, she really messed with me the other week at the supermarket, and I can't deal with her. Baseless hatred. I can't deal with that woman. It's a little deeper than that, and I'll go into the details directly from the Talmud. The Jewish Talmud has a story of the destruction of Jerusalem. The Talmud likes to go off topic a lot of the time, and this is one of the off-topic stories that's explaining why Jerusalem was destroyed. And the reason for Jerusalem was destroyed was Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, two guys. There was a wedding happening in Jerusalem around 66 AD, I want to say, almost exactly. And the host of the wedding sent out invitations to Kamsa. He would send his servant to go give an invitation to Kamsa. But his servant instead sent the invitation to Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa being the sworn enemy of the guy who was hosting the wedding. Oops. So the servant goes and delivers it to Bar Kamsa. Bar Kamsa, I'm sure, was a little shocked at this whole scenario and comes to the wedding. And the host of the wedding sees Bar Kamsa at the wedding, his sworn enemy, and says, "Get out of here. You cannot stay at this wedding. Absolutely not. This is not going to happen." And Bar Kamsa says, listen. Here's what I'm going to do. I will pay for my portion of the wedding. So you don't have to, you didn't spend anything for me being here. I'm just going to eat my plate. I'm just going to, and then get out. No. What if I sponsor half of this entire wedding feast? Absolutely not. You cannot stay here under no circumstances. You're out. What if I sponsor the entire wedding feast? This is Jerusalem, 66 AD. I mean, this guy, he's offering to put up quite a bit of gold at the time. I mean, it's a whole wedding feast. And the host of the wedding says, absolutely not. You have to leave. What happens then is that Bar Kamsa goes to the Roman authorities. He goes to Vespasian in the Roman Empire at the time, who was in charge of Jerusalem, and he says, "You know what? The Jews are rebelling against you. How do you know? How can we tell?" And so Bar Kamsa says, "Give an offering to the temple, and I promise you, the Jews will not accept that offering." So offerings were given to the temple by the nations at the time, and they're given by Jews at the time, essentially. And what Bar Kamsa does is he goes up and he gives a tiny, tiny little blemish on the cow's upper eye, an area that would not render the sacrifice to be insufficient for the Romans, but it would definitely render it to be insufficient for the Jewish prayers at the time. The rabbis see this offering, this cow with the blemish, and they say, we can't accept this, but maybe we should anyway. They understand finally what Bar Kamsa has done, and maybe we should accept this anyway. We should take the cow to the temple, and we have the debate within the orthodoxy, like what we have today, of, well, for the sake of peace, we could maybe do this, and maybe for the sake of our religious traditions, we should do that. And the conflict between the two of them creates that friction and debate that we're very familiar with today within the Jewish communities. No Christians have ever fought over any issue before, so I know a lot of people can't relate here. But essentially, this heifer is the main source of contention. And finally, the rabbis say, we can't accept this sacrifice. We can't accept the sacrifice to the temple, and for that, the Romans besieged Jerusalem and destroy it 4 years later. And the rabbis even say at the time a little bit of it's something a little bit prophetic at the time too. Like they're seeing 4 years in the future, and they say, for this we will be destroyed. For this specific issue, we will be destroyed. So I want to point out a couple of things about this story that kind of maybe relates to our times, and give a call to action for Christians, Jews, anyone who's related to the Temple Mount and to Israel, around the world. It's not exactly the fight between enemies that you're hearing about in this specific story to illustrate baseless hatred. It's rather a fight between your friends and your enemies at the same time. Bar Kamsa is a representative of the enemy of this host of this wedding. He doesn't get along with him already, and the temple wasn't destroyed because they weren't getting along. The temple was destroyed because this man shamed this guy who's his enemy, this guy who's different from him, this guy who he's basically shamed and segregated and left out of the community. For that, Jerusalem is destroyed at the end of the day. And not only that, one of the major issues that Bar Kamsa is witnessing at this time is the rabbinical figures that are attending this wedding and ignoring him. They're just ignoring essentially his presence at the wedding, and they're ignoring the fact that he's been thrown out of the wedding at the end of the day. And their sitting by is essentially one of the huge pushes for him to go all the way to the Romans and say, the Jews are rebelling against you, fully knowing that he could spark a revolution and destroy the entirety of the Jewish site, the Jewish temple. It's that we should consider essentially is the decency that we need to embody in order to bring the temple back, I believe, in our days. We speak about baseless hatred. We know it, we're very familiar with the concept now of baseless hatred is shaming another human being just because I can't deal with him. I can't, have him at my dinner parties. I can't, see him around town. I need to get him out of here. I need to, distance myself from him as far as possible. But it's rather the solution that we're also seeing through this kind of illustration, through this story of how we can come together. And with that, I see this really incredible bond that's happening between Christians and Jews around the world. I see this bond and this understanding of accepting people who don't look like you and don't even agree with you on most things, and coming together to rebuild the temple. Where here, step by step, it starts with the nation of Israel returning home, then it goes to the the establishment of the state of Israel, and then it goes to the re-election of Bibi. I'm just kidding. Then it goes to step by step. It goes to step by step to bring about the end times, the messianic times, and that is done through, I believe, the opposite of this baseless hatred, the opposite of rejecting a fellow just because of the way they dress, the way that they believe and who they are, but rather it's accepting one another. I'll say one more thing as well, is that you can sort of see this reflection of this acceptance of your enemy, of this acceptance of not someone who's not exactly your friend, in the Israeli policy today. And I'll point it out for you, basically where you might be able to look for it. When I was in the Army, when I was in the IDF, our rules of engagement were not shoot if you are shot. It's not to fire if fired upon. It was look first, see that you're not going to hit any other person who's not shooting you, and then you have the permission to fire back. The policy in the IDF was to drop flyers on huge, densely populated areas that are launching rockets at civilian populations and endangering the lives of your friends and family at home, and telling them ahead of time, we don't want to hurt you, we don't want to kill you, we don't want to harm you, we want to essentially just get the people who are shooting us and respond to them in kind of and disarm them, essentially, if we can. And this, too, is sort of a reflection of what's happening in these end times. We're seeing sort of a level of morality which is not just to reach out and love your fellow human being, but it's actually to act more morally towards our enemies as well.